Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be looking at the Palace of Versailles. We're going to be talking about the different royal apartments, how it worked at Versailles, and just general information. So stay tuned and let's go. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with Versailles, it's the famous palace of Louis XIV, son King of France, and he was the one who completely redesigned the original chateau that was at Versailles, that used to belong to his father, Louis XIII, and Louis XIV completely transformed the very sort of primitive residence into one of the grandest palaces in Europe. So now we're looking at the Hall of Mirrors, which was basically the centre of the Palace of Versailles. It was possibly the most glorious creation of Louis XIV at Versailles, and it would have been used for balls on special occasions, banquets, very important court functions would have been held here, wedding receptions, Christmas celebrations, anything to do with festivities, fun, would have been held in here. Also, this was obviously it would have been a very formal space back in the day, and whenever you appeared in public at Versailles, you always had to dress in your finest clothes, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But this is also part of the King's Grand Apartment, and people would wait here to see the King, which is in his bedchamber just next door to the Hall of Mirrors. And we're going to take a look at that now. So this is the famous bedchamber of Louis XIV. It's incredibly grand because he was the most important man in his realm, and so he had the most glorious bedchamber created, and this was a place where the court would attend what was known as the levee ceremony, in which members of the aristocracy would stand behind the railing there and watch the king being undressed out of his nightwear and dressed into his day clothes. And although the ceremony sounds very unusual to us today, but back then it was a very important place to be, because you would be noticed by the king, you were his audience, you were there, and he would notice you, and it's a great place to ask for favours, for friends or family or for yourself, and it's just a very, very important place to be. Very important members of the aristocracy would be there, such as dukes, marquises, counts, earls. Anybody who was important in France would have most likely been in this room during the levee ceremony. And the same would have been for the Queen, although the Queen would have a female audience and the King would have a male audience. And we'll take a look at the Queen's bedchamber. So this is possibly my most favourite room in the Palace of Versailles because of its grand, opulent Rococo style. This is also the famous location in which Queen Marie Antoinette would have slept. 3 successive queens would have actually occupied this room during the different centuries of Versailles. We would have had Marie Therese during the reign of Louis XIV. We would have had Marie Leczinska, who was wife of Louis XV. And then we have, of course, the very well-known Marie Antoinette, who was the wife of Louis XVI. And of course, she was the last queen here, so she did a lot of alterations to this room and also her private apartments, which are located behind. But this room in particular was very much embellished by Marie Antoinette, including the wall hangings, the bed hangings. If you look there on top of the bed, there's this beautiful balustrade that supports all those bed hangings just there. And you can see the Habsburg eagle, because of course Marie Antoinette was Austrian, and the whole reason behind her marriage to Louis XVI was to cement a alliance between Austria and France to settle their feuding or whatever was going on between them, but that's for another story. But today we're focusing on some of the most famous rooms in the Palace of Versailles. Now, as I mentioned before, the king would have had a levee ceremony where he would have woken up early in the morning and he would have been undressed and redressed in front of very high-ranking members of aristocracy. And the same applied for the Queen. They would both wake up at the same time, and they would both be dressed in front of people, semi-naked in front of the court. And although it sounds strange, but like I said, it's a very important place to be seen. And how it works here is that when the Queen was being dressed, any high-ranking member of aristocracy who was dressing the Queen would have done so, but then if another member of high-ranking aristocracy would have walked into the room, the position would have then been passed on to that other member of aristocracy, and that's how it worked within the system. So if the Queen was being dressed, and a duchess walked in, the lady who was dressing her beforehand would then have to pass the position on to the next lady who just walked in, and this could go on for hours, and the Queen could be standing there semi-naked in front of aristocracy of France for hours on end, and this could go on for a long time. And it was a very strange way of doing things, I must say. We can see here, this is another shot of the Queen's bedchamber at Versailles, and it really shows off the magnificence of the room. And this balustrade here is a kind of barrier, because it separates the audience from the royals. Obviously the rooms would have been very, very public back in the day, so there would have been a huge crowd here, so the balustrade would have been necessary to keep the crowd back, and especially when the Queen was having a baby, because when she was giving birth, the room was it was the courtier's right to be able to witness the Queen giving birth, and this room would have been packed full of people trying to get a glimpse of the Queen, trying to see if it was true or not that the Queen was having a baby. Now we're going to talk about the revolution side of things. So, Marie Antoinette was in this bedchamber when she would have heard people screaming and shouting, making lots of noise, and the thunderous sound of loads of feet on the floor running to try and find the Queen. And you see here, to the left of the bed there, the rioters who broke into the palace stormed her apartments, trying to locate the Queen because they wanted to kill her. They hated her so much, they wanted to find her and kill her. And so the Queen was rushed, dressed quickly by her servants, and she would have been ushered to this door, hurried down a hallway, and this all sort of section through that door is a series of small cabinets that would have been used as maybe bathrooms or private sitting rooms. But the Queen would have run through there in a hurry to then go and see the King in the King's bedchamber and kind of huddle with the family in there, because that leads to the King's chambers through that door. And it would have been a scene of horror. When the rioters broke in, they would have ripped the Queen's bed to pieces and completely ransacked the room trying to locate the Queen. And if they did find her, like I say, they would have killed her, because they just hated her so much. But that's the end of the Queen's bedchamber section of this, and we're going to move on to the Chapel Royal. Welcome to the glorious Chapel Royal of the Palace of Versailles. This is truly a room of French Renaissance style. It is the epitome of French Baroque, which is an incredibly grand royal sort of style, which is very much featured in the Palace of Versailles. Versailles is a blend of Rococo and Baroque styles, because obviously the palace would have been occupied by successive monarchs who would have changed the interiors of Versailles according to the fashions of the age. As you can see here, we've got a beautiful dome ceiling, which I believe has a picture of God in the centre, or some kind of mirage image on the ceiling of some kind of allegorical scenery. So as you can see, there's two sort of areas there supported by columns, and the naves as they're called. This is where kind of very important members of the aristocracy would have stood to attend mass, and they would have been up here because obviously they're important, and the lower ranking members of aristocracy and the public would have been located on the ground floor. Where the camera's positioned in this picture, there's actually a stall, like a box, where the royal family would have sat and watched the ceremony. This is their own little section of the chapel, and the royals would have sat here. They would have attended mass. They would have gone there every Sunday, and it was a very private little area of the chapel. All the same, I think it's an incredibly opulent space, beautiful in design, really is something. So I didn't feel like I completely went into detail about the King's chambers. We mostly spoke about his bedchamber, but we can speak about this room. This room is called the Salle du Boeuf, and basically it's a room that connects the King's private apartments to his inner chamber, where his bedchamber is located. This is also a room that connects Marie Antoinette's private chambers to the King's apartments, and the King's apartments are located in the centre of Versailles, behind the Hall of Mirrors, and the Queen would have run through here during the Revolution. This room would have also been used as a waiting room for courtiers who were waiting to see the monarch, and you can see a painting on the wall there of Louis XIV and his family. They're all dressed like Greek gods. Very, very fantasy indeed. So here he is, the man himself, Louis XIV, the creator of Versailles. You might think it's weird that he has long hair and he looks very feminine, but that was very much popular in the 17th century. Men would wear big wigs, mostly because Louis XIV was quite a short man, I believe, and he would have big long wigs, piled high into the air, and it would kind of make up for his short height. He also was a fan of high-heeled shoes, which would have had the famous red heel on them, and he was also a fan of very sort of crazy fashions, lots of lace, lots of all kinds of materials. He was a very opulent man in terms of fashion, and in Versailles the male courtiers would have copied him whatever he wore. So the king could turn up in some kind of new outfit, and the aristocracy would copy what he wore. You have to remember that in this kind of age of history, there weren't really any celebrities or anybody of high importance other than the king and the queen. So many people, not just the aristocracy, but the public themselves, would copy what the king and the queen were wearing, because it was seen as the centre of fashion. Louis XIV, like I say, was the centre of fashion, and so would have been the queen, equally the same. So now we've skipped ahead in history, and we're talking about female fashion. This here is the Princess de Lamballe. She was a member of the high-ranking aristocracy. She was a very distant member of the royal family, and she was a princess of the blood. And she was also a very close friend of Marie Antoinette. She was part of her entourage, and here we see her. Now, I think the women in Versailles would have powdered their faces, they would have powdered their big hair, and they would have worn lots of rouge on. Queen Marie Antoinette would have put her makeup on during her levee in front of the audience. And they all wore these massive wigs with lots of feathers and bows and all kinds of designs. I think the Queen herself would have probably worn lots of jewels in her hair, things like that. But the females of the court would copy what the Queen wore, and as she got older, she would have changed her fashions, and so would the court according to what she wore. The Princess de Lamballe met a nasty end during the Revolution, but she was stuck with Marie Antoinette till the very end. So we're going to look a little bit more into female fashion now at Versailles. This dress here, I believe, was a wedding dress, and I believe it was worn by one of Marie Antoinette's sisters. And it also looks like it's displayed in the Grand Trianon of Versailles, which is like a country house in the grounds of the main building. This gown is very opulent. It's obviously a ceremonial gown, but the female clothing of the court would have been essentially the same, with the wide hips, the silks, very grand materials. French court fashion would have changed during the seasons. Ladies and gentlemen would wear thicker materials during the winter. In the summertime, they might have worn thinner, more nicer materials. But even so, even though they were thinner materials during the summer, it's been noted that the men and women would have sweated like anything during those hot French summers. And they say in the French court in the 18th century, it wasn't the most hygienic place to be. Let's just say that. And one of those things, it wouldn't have smelt that great. And I mean, between you and me, that could have been one of the reasons why, is because the court still insisted on wearing these thick material clothing, even in the heat of the summer. But I still think the clothes are incredibly grand. Totally impractical, you couldn't move anywhere in those sort of things. But then again, why would the royals need to move? But yes, very grand all the same. So we're just going to look at this courtyard very briefly. How it works is the larger rooms are constructed on the outside of the building, sort of in the enfilade, and then in the smaller courtyards there would have been split levels of floors which would have housed small rooms. Louis XV himself fitted out tiny little cabinets on several floors, and they would have been used as dining rooms, bedrooms, bathrooms, things like that. And the Marie Antoinette apparently had a very large private apartment, and she expanded it onto several floors when she was queen. But this is how it would work. So the larger rooms were built in the front, and then in the back, the smaller cabinets would have been built around these courtyards. And apparently, it's been said that lazy servants would have chucked human feces out of the buckets onto the courtyard floor. So the ladies and gentlemen cutting through the courtyards, they would have had to have watched out for that. We've looked at female fashion, so let's look at the men's. This style here, I think, was very much popular during the reign of Louis XV, with the long hair. Clothing in the 18th century, especially Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI's reign, the lace around the neck, things like that would have gotten smaller. Fashions changed. Things were less extravagant, and they kind of toned it down, especially in the late 18th century. But we're looking at the male fashion. Men in those days actually used to wear makeup faces. Of course, there were diseases and things going around in those days, because they had no cure for things, and so men and women alike would have covered up their faces with powder to cover the marks or anything left on their faces. Here you can see a beautiful sort of waistcoat of the male fashion at court. Probably would have been a member of the royal family's item of clothing. Looks like it's been embroidered with cloth with thread of gold, and it looks like an incredibly grand piece. Here are just some quick shots of some of the rooms located within Marie Antoinette's private chambers at Versailles. You can see her opulent style. White and gold was also a very popular combination for wall decoration during the 18th century. We can see the cabinet meridian here. This would have been used as somewhere to lay down and rest. Would have been used as maybe a small sitting room where the Queen might paint or do things she might have enjoyed in her private life. Again, the private apartments would have been used for private life, because being in the grand, large chambers of Versailles, the Hall of Mirrors, etc., that would have been your public lifestyle. But then you could retreat to these private rooms beyond those grand chambers, where you could sit and write and maybe practice playing instruments or doing things you enjoy. And this would have been very much a safe haven for Marie Antoinette at Versailles. Probably why she loved the Trianon so much, the Petit Trianon, so much because it was a place of retreat, somewhere she could get away from the court. We've spoken so much of her, but we haven't had a look at her yet. This is Queen Marie Antoinette, although I believe she was still Dauphine when this picture was painted, which means Crown Princess. Dauphin is Crown Prince. She would have come to France and she would have been put through what's called the handover. So there would have been a temporary structure built in the middle of the woods not far from Versailles, and she would have passed through one room and been stripped of all of her Austrian belongings, and then she would have passed through into the next chamber where they would have dressed her in French fashions, and then she would have proceeded on to Versailles. Marie Antoinette's fashion choices and styles would have been extremely extravagant. Here you can see her hair is quite small and petite and all tucked away behind her head. But later in her life, as we all know, she would have decorated her hair with all kinds of accessories. Her hair would have grown to extreme heights, 3 feet sometimes. She really amazed people with what they could have done with hair back in those days. And she really set the fashion for large hair, especially with the court. So I think that all sums it up. Thank you very much, guys, for watching. I really do appreciate it. I know this kind of little show was quite short and quite brief, but I was just explaining Versailles, what it was like, the court, etc. And I really hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to carry on this series. I did a video ages ago about it, but I just never really continued it. But we're going to continue it now. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe. Tell me what you thought. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Let me know. I'm interested. And yeah, I'll be seeing you soon, guys. Thanks for watching.